first, I want to recap for you some of the major pieces of legislation that were passed last year. We actually had a pretty lengthy lame duck session in January of 2021, and the spring session, in addition to a spring session, as well as a fall veto session. So the way in which things work in Illinois is, yes, we can have a lame duck session before new members are seated. Or at the end of one session before the next one starts. We also have what's called a veto session. So that usually comes up in November. If we can jump to the next slide, the veto session usually comes up in November, October-November time period. And usually that's there so that if the governor vetoes any legislation, the legislature can come back and decide, are we going to override it? Or are we going to accept amendments if the governor put amendments in? But in reality, the fall veto session wound up being a time to try to, again, ram through some additional legislation and clean up some other pieces of legislation that got passed that also had problems. Now, the main piece of legislation that you may be hearing about, it's being called criminal justice reform. I'm not sure that it's a reform that I usually think of reform as having some good connotations. I was very concerned about this piece of criminal justice legislation because one of the main centerpieces for it is to end cash bail starting in January of 2023. So currently, our judges do have some discretion to set bail amounts, based on somebody. It can be based on someone's means. It can be based on the severity of the crime, and it can be used as an alternative to electronic monitoring, which is pretty much the only other method that we have for pretrial detention, aside from actually putting someone in, having actual pretrial detention at one of the local prison within the prison system. And what this is essentially saying is that we're not going to require people to post a bond to appear for a whole host of different crimes. I voted against that because in other states, and particularly in Chicago, where there was a pilot program that started in 2017 to try to reduce or minimize cash bail or expand the use of certain types of diversion programs. Some of them can be successful. A lot of them haven't been. It's actually led to an increase in crime, and we're seeing a lot of that now in DuPage County. Personally, I think it's going to get even worse once this legislation goes into effect in January of 2023. Another big piece of legislation related to it was referred to as another green energy package. We have a situation in Illinois where some of our nuclear plants were actually potentially on the verge of shutdown. That's actually not good for the district that we live in because 80% of the electricity that we generate in the northern Illinois region where we live is generated through nuclear power, and in terms of turning your lights on and that sort of and running industry. This is going to basically create some additional wind and solar energy subsidies in addition to changing some of the pricing structures for some of our other energy delivery, and it's going to have a price tag for an average, low-level residential consumer of about $657 a month. There's always a risk that pricing can continue to increase. Another big issue that was being pushed related to parental notification in connection with an underage child, your daughter trying to get an abortion. So in Illinois, we have not had in law for a very long time any requirement that parents actually give consent to their minor child receiving an abortion. However, several years ago we did, and it was actually subjected to a lot of challenge and litigation, and it was finally blessed by the courts to say, yes, it was appropriate to notify a parent, not both parents, at least a parent, that their underage child was going to be having an abortion. And the reason behind that was twofold. Number one of the things that we found in Illinois is that when it comes to underage sex trafficking, it's not uncommon that those women will be directed towards the abortion clinic. And those are actually instances where the parental notification law has allowed the state of Illinois to actually catch people who are engaging in trafficking. Another related issue is that from a parent's point of view, and I say this as a parent of a daughter, if your daughter does go through this procedure, there are certainly risks that can happen if there were to be a late subsequent infection or something along those lines. If you as a parent want to know, does my child need immediate medical care? Notification that she did go through an abortion procedure is going to help you make sure that your child, your daughter can stay safe. But unfortunately, the Democrats voted, it was party line vote in favor of it. There were actually bipartisan votes against it, and the governor is signing it. Limiting the Illinois Right of Conscience Act. The Illinois Right of Conscience Act was actually drafted very broadly to essentially give you not only rights, but also a remedy to go after individuals who were trying to force you to undergo certain medical procedures, or for people working in the healthcare industry who are being asked to participate in medical procedures where they had a conscientious objection to the procedure being performed. Governor Pritzker, this was one of his very big initiatives in the veto session, was to essentially strip your right to object based on conscience rights in connection with things such as COVID-19 vaccine mandates. This was a hugely contentious issue. And in fact, as a legislator, one of the things that we get in connection with pieces of legislation is when there are people who are opposed, you can file witness slips. There were, I believe, over 60,000 witness slips that were, filed in opposition. Certainly our office, we received hundreds, if not thousands of phone calls from people and emails from people who were objecting to, eliminating people's rights of conscience. And unfortunately, that didn't matter to the majority party or to the governor. And that also got signed. But because interestingly, because there were so many Democrats who were opposed to passing this legislation, if you want to pass a piece of legislation during the veto session that's going to have an immediate effective date, it actually increases the threshold of votes that you need to have to get it to pass for an immediate effect. Because they didn't have the votes for that, they changed it to have an effective date of June 1st, 2022. So, at the very least, we'll certainly have some additional cases and court proceedings and additional facts and data that hopefully will lessen the need or the adverse consequences of removing people's rights of conscience. But I strongly opposed eliminating the Rights of Conscience Act. I don't believe that. I think that government is in a dangerous place when you're asking people to violate their sincerely held beliefs. Another big piece of legislation that was being pushed by the teachers unions and various political activist groups is revising the sex ed standards. These are highly age inappropriate, and they're going far beyond just providing individuals with, particular facts. In fact, one of the doctors who spoke against these particular sex ed standards called them analogous to trying to groom children for sexual exploitation. Fortunately, you as a parent do have the right to opt out of this curriculum. But to me, it's actually very disturbing that this is something that the Democrats decided to put a lot of their time and attention behind, particularly when there's so many other issues that are pressing for Illinois.